So one question for the audience. We're doing 5 homes here tonight. We're doing 140 Black Rock Turnpike. We're doing 230 Harvey Hollow Road. We're doing 10 Cross Highway. And then we're doing Little Linta and the new Swanfield. Does anybody here has anybody here lived in those houses or own those houses now? Which one?
10 Cross Highway.
Cool.
Nice. So that's the beginning. And that's really become a really interesting topic for me. Because within our research, this is one of the most significant historical buildings in our town. Whether you think about the church or you think about town government, a lot of it happened here. Cross Highway was at the very end of what we call the Long Lots. So we were once part of Fairfield. It all ended here, and obviously in that time frame, religion was very important. And this was the house of the religious leader starting in
1753 for this one. This was Reverend Nathaniel Bartlett's house, and he was the second minister of the Congregational Church. Reverend Hunn was the first minister, and he lived right across the street from this particular house.
Yeah, and it's a really, really neat place. Clover Farm ties into a creamery, or a dairy farm.
Grocery store.
And but starting from the very beginning, you have Nathaniel Bartlett coming here, and then he ties into the Sanford family. And that was the neat thing for myself was that I grew up in Reading, and Jesse P. Sanford was a big part of my life because he ran the Reading Girls Boys Club. But the Sanford family was a big part of this house and tied into the history of it. The Sanford family was much larger than you think. It wasn't just one family, it was actually 4 families. So 4 Sanford families separately came to Reading, Connecticut, and this was just one part.
And they worshiped in different churches. This family worshiped in the Congregational Church, and then you've got Aaron Sanford Sr., who was one of the founders of the Methodist Society, founded the Methodist Church, and then you've got other Sanfords who couldn't make it to the Episcopal Church on the Ridge. So they're all over the place, even with religion. They weren't all got the same last name, but they're not necessarily on the same page as to how they felt about the town. Everybody in the Sanford family was a big contributor to the town, right? Throughout its history. This house started off as a salt box with 4 fireplaces, 3 on the main floor, which was pretty typical, and 1 upstairs. I think it was 3 sleeping chambers upstairs. When the Reverend Bartlett was here, this was during the Revolutionary War, he also ran a boys' school or academy, or what you want to talk about. He educated Joe Barlow, and he also educated Timothy Dwight. And then when he died, his son, Jonathan Bartlett,
Kind of overlapped.
yeah, he inherited the house, and he became minister of the church upon his dad's death.
Yeah, so Jonathan kind of overlapped him. I think the Reverend Nathaniel died in 1810, but starting in like 1796, his son came on and kind of was, helping him out in moving the house and moving the religion.
We'll see here that there was 5 families that lived in this house for 220 years, and they were all related.
So as we jump ahead, Jonathan and LeMay, or how do you pronounce that? Lemuel Sanford. So they both live in the same house. So Lemuel comes into play soon after, and he's the one that adds the Greek Revival addition to the house.
He has this addition over here.
Right.
And in 1847, when I put this addition on, this is 11 years before Jonathan dies. So it became a 2-family house. So you had Lemuel move in, and Lemuel had 10 kids. Lemuel lived in the small side of the house where there's 10 children. And that year he became the judge of probate. He was elected to the state senate. He also served as the town treasurer for a while and the town clerk.
And you have the post office.
No, he didn't start the post office.
But you have it.
Yeah, well, that's because this particular drawing was drawn in 1938 by the Historical American Home Survey. I think it's HABS. Historical American Building Survey, HABS. It was done by the WPA. And when I first showed this to Brent goes, there's a problem here. What's that? He says, there's no bathrooms in the house.
That was this one. That was the change. So yeah, I got, that was the thing. I got chamber, where's the bathroom?
We were there, it's outhouse.
And
This is in 1938, and they still did not have regular plumbing in the house in 1938. So it went on for a long time.
and hence the term chamber pot. Because they didn't have bathrooms, but it's just interesting to think about that. I mean, yeah, you have like, you have 10 kids and 5 other adults, 15 people living in this house. And you have like the bathrooms kind of here, they call the shed.
Yeah, and you can see underneath there's a clean out area there. And this would have to be cleaned out a couple of times a year in order to keep it manageable. And it was generally done in cooler weather because it wasn't a very pleasant job in warm weather. But this is the 1910 census, shows 15 people living here. You've got Jonathan B. Stanford Sr., and he was married to Edith Dayton Stanford.
Dayton Road.
Dayton Road comes from her brother. And then she's got an aunt, James Gregory, who ran the post office, and the post office was right down here. And at the time, JB, he was the judge of probate. And we also had Edith's aunt living there, and Jonathan's older sister, Sarah. When the post office was run here, again, you had James Gregory, who was the first postmaster here in this house, then Sarah Stanford, then Edith Stanford, and then her daughter, Clara Stanford, were all postmistresses in this particular house in the site.
So from 1882 to 1933,
Yeah.
post office.
I think it's a little later, but she was appointed, I think, in 33. And Clara ended up marrying Dr. George Babbitt, and she was a town clerk at the time.
So it's like, that's why we say that this is one of the most significant houses in town when you think about either town religion or town government.
Town leaders.
Yeah. And this is a list of what they did and who they are.
The years that are up here are the years that they lived in this house, not the years that they lived.
They served.
The total. And Jonathan Bartlett, when he was judge of probate, he also had a Clover Farm Creamery. And the creamery was built right next to the door of the house. It was fairly good size, and it was they processed milk and cream, and they also sold groceries.
And it was a beautiful property for it, because if you think about it, if you look at this property in the present day, like say Google Earth, it still goes all the way back to Deer Hill. It was just a wonderful property. I mean, it's visually beautiful from the road, but it goes way, way back if you look at it.
Well, it was originally 80 acres there. How many acres are there now?
22 and a half.
20, so you want fortunately, so.
Yeah, and it still pretty much looks the way that it did because of open space.
Some of you may remember Bart Stanford, who was the first selectman in town after Samuelson died. And he was probably there for about 10, 15 years as the first selectman. Samuelson was probably the first selectman for Georgetown.
That was
the longest.
So JB was there until 1969, and then Jesse P. Stanford took over until 1977, and then Mary Ann Guitar came in 1977. So she effectively was a Democrat. She ended not 44 years of Republican leadership, and it's kind of been a mixed bag from there, based between like independents and Democrats and stuff. So it's a really, really neat, like I said at the beginning, it's a really interesting and very important property in town. This is the next one. I love this one because when I was with the Boys Club in summer camp, we used to come here and meet on Thursdays and swim here. This was John Thomas's house. He was a counselor with us, and before this I had the Dobson family owned it, and and Mr. Dobson was a football coach of mine, and he had a son, JT, and Reaper. So I'm very familiar with the property, but it's another historically significant house in town in terms of country homes.
Definitely people who live there.
Yeah.
This house started off as the Abel Morehouse house in 1767, and then after that went to Lazarus Beach. Lazarus Beach was the son of Reverend James Beach, who was the minister of the Episcopal Church during the Revolutionary War. So all these houses go back to the Revolutionary War for the people who lived there. And then after he lived there, the house I think went to Hiram and Mary Bradley, and they lived in the house for a number of years until probably the late 1800s. It stayed in that family. Their son Paul Bradley was delivered to them. He was posted on a horse delivered to them, and he kept the house until the late 1800s. There was a lot of people that owned this house had a lot of economic problems. This house was foreclosed on 2 or 3 times during that particular period of time. In the late 1800s, around 1900, the house was foreclosed on and was sold to a lady named Ferris who lived in Easton. And then if you'll do the next slide, we'll see what the house looked like. This is in 1902. This house is in pretty poor shape. In 1902, Julia Sanford lived on the ridge. She lived at the next house we'll be looking at, or one of the next houses, 140 Black Rock Turnpike. Julia also sold real estate. So she bought this house, kind of like a straw buyer, I guess, because she paid $275 for it, and the next day turned around and sold it to Ella and Noble Hodgson from Manhattan for $275. And it came, I think, with 7 acres of land, I think, at that particular time, and then he bought more and more land after that. Hodgson was an architect, a builder, and a writer. He built a lot of banks in New York City, and he published his own magazine called Hodgson Quarterly. He and his family and friends ended up buying most of the houses that were in this particular area. They probably bought a total of about 5 or 6 houses that they renovated, and they bought another 5 or 6 houses that they just tore down. They had their own idea of what colonial America should look like. And it wasn't what, you see what this house looks like now, and you see what they turned it into. They turned it into an elegant house, but it wasn't anything like the house was originally built. And I said, they all had their idea of what they thought colonial America should look like. He didn't even like the idea that this was called Poverty Hollow. He changed the name to Pleasant Valley.
Yeah, and it really became that way too. That's a look at one of the renovations.
Yeah, this is the first renovation. This is just one thing, but again, you can see on this there's the outhouse on the back.
Yep.
So this is before any running water was put into the house, long before electricity. Electricity didn't come to the valley probably until at least the 1920s, maybe the early 1930s. This is also before we put a big smokehouse kitchen on the back of the house, which is absolutely gorgeous. That was before they did this too.
It's also interesting to think about the location and how they got goods or things, lumber, whatever else here. There wasn't like a railroad right across the way. Either you had to go from down in this area, West Reading or Georgetown, or come from the Newtown, Bethel area. So it wasn't easy to do what they did.
It's also interesting to know how Hodgson found this house in Reading. His wife was, her sister was married to a gentleman by the name of Fred Driggs. Fred Driggs built a log cabin on Goodrich Road, which is still standing, and his barn is still standing there. He would come up here and go quail hunting, and he would stay with Julia Sanford and Annie Mason Reed up on the ridge, because he was the nephew of Marshall Driggs, who was married to a Sanford. And Sanfords are always connected to every one of these things when we're looking at these houses. And I said, when Noble Hodgson came up here, he just fell in love with the valley. He wanted a working farm. This is what he calls a chicken coop.
When you think about this is in the present day, this is big.
Yeah, this was built in 1905, right? It's got heat. There's a furnace in there, because you can see that there's a chimney there for heating it. It's screened in. It looks more like a hotel or motel from the 1950s or the 1960s than it does a chicken coop. I mean, he didn't spare any money when he did anything. This is the barn that they built. The barn has it's supposedly renovated, but pretty much tore down, I think.
All here was the ballroom.
Yeah. It started off as a barn, and then later on, it became a ballroom up top, and a beautiful hardwood floors on it. And they had a lot of dances and musical entertainment.
It was always an entertainment. I mean, and that would just continue up until when Bruce was in high school.
Yes.
You don't know much about that.
I don't know anything. But this is, he made the house totally about 3 times its original size. So I said, it really got kind of carried away, but it's beautiful. He aimed at the Fairfield Manor, and he featured it often in his quarterly magazine. I went through 2 or 3 of his quarterly magazines not too long ago, and within inside of a year and a half, I found 6 different articles that were written about this house. He was very proud of it.
Here's the
That's the
magazine.
magazine.
And
That's the first issue.
That's my favorite part, what a library means to its town. That's what we're here tonight, right?
Yeah.
Here's a side view with the,
Grape arbors. So you put the grape arbors going to the back. This photograph was probably taken in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Hodgson's grew all their own grapes during Prohibition because they made wine for their guests and themselves. So, there was no such thing as this being a dry estate. You'll see in the next picture, I think, there's not just wine and stuff, but there's rum down here, and there's a few other things.
actually, this like moved me way so much that I actually wrote it down, and I don't write things down.
So I looked up each one of these things.
So in the basement, there were honeycombs for 700 plus bottles of wine. There were racks for 25-gallon casks of wine, and cider racks for 8 50-gallon barrels of wine. Of cider. That's great.
It's thoughtful. The stone walls in the grape arbors are still, many of them are still standing there. So I don't know if it's still growing decent grapes and you can make wine from it. But this is a fairly recent picture of the back of the state.
And that was the pool that when we were kids at Reading Boys and Girls Club. But you know, when you came out here, like you had to be careful of the bees. The bees, yes. It was August and the grapes were going bad. There was a lot of bees.
Much of the landscaping here was done by his son. And his son was a well-known landscaper. His son had worked with, what's his guy? What's the guy who did Central Park? Olmsted, yeah. His son worked with Olmsted for a while. Yep.
No, it's beautiful, and it's really stayed solid.
But these were party people. They were known as the Valley Crowd. And they were there every week. And it wasn't just a summer house. These people came even in the middle of the winter. They came out of ice skating.
Nice hockey.
They had weddings. This is walking down Poverty Hollow Road to go to a wedding at the house next door that they also renovated. The other picture is from one of the 4th of July parties that they had. They actually built their own little houses for 4th of July and had their own little play areas for 4th of July. And I remember one 4th of July, at the end, they burned one of the houses down so the firemen could only practice and put it out. Party.
But they were like really making a statement about country living and country houses and summer houses, and that was the only other thing that I wrote down was that in one of the articles they wrote in the magazine, he said, "You become admirable by admirable deeds, beautiful by planning beautiful things. This is really the object and the end of his whole drift towards the country. We wish to get out of the city to plant fine ideas in the soil." So that was really, you know, what they were looking to do, and we continue to do that in the present day. This one's long.
Yeah, he even made his own road sign. This is really interesting. This was still standing when I was a kid. This is at the foot of Churchill at the intersection with Poverty Hollow. And you can see the sign that says Reading. There's actually the number of miles to each one of these towns is covered by the vines in there. And it says Reading, and it points up Churchill. Bridgeport points to the south on Poverty Hollow. The other side says Newtown. And the interesting one says Uncle John's, and it's named for Uncle John Stetson, which is his neighbor, and it was 1,110 feet away, down the road from Uncle John's way.
And if you do Google Earth, it runs just to the right of the house, and it's a road that goes all the way to the back, so it's very in the back of the property. Still there.
Yep. I love this.
This is your favorite.
Yeah, this is my favorite. This is, 1911, if you didn't like your old style King's Trust Bridge, it was running in front of your house, you just hired a contractor and you built your own bridge and at your own expense, out of stone, and this bridge is still standing, and we're talking about it's 115 years old. So if any of you live on Sport Hill Road and you'd like a new bridge, that's the way to do it.
We have a question from the virtual audience,
Sure.
asking how did Poverty Hollow get its name?
Basically, we didn't get a railroad, and the factories down there kind of fell into disrepair, and that's.
Well, it was mostly because there was a lot of poor people that lived in that valley that were employed by the factories. There weren't that many factories in Reading, but there were 3 button factories. There was a sawmill down there. There was an iron foundry down there, all owned by the Stanford family. They're all owned by James Stanford. And that area was known to be fairly poor because of the people that lived there. There was a lot of the houses that Hodgson bought and he tore down, but they were tenement houses. So there were houses that housed 2, 3, 4 families at the time. So we think that that's how it's got its name, but we're not. A lot of this stuff is supposition on the part of historians, and we kind of do a little bit of research and just kind of come to the conclusion that we think that it's not written down anywhere or exactly how that's done.
Okay, thank you.
Before and after.
Yeah, this is a living room in 1920, and then what it looks like 100 years later. A lot of the rooms in the house haven't changed very much, and some of them are dramatic.
And then the house is massive. We, when we got a chance to, when we were there for, the Boys Club and Girls Club, we played hide and go seek. And there's plenty of times when, someone had to walk back from the house to the Reading Boys and Girls Club because no one found you.
It's got to be like 6,000 square feet.
It's big.
Big house.
I had to walk back once. And that's where you learn with Churchill. That's where I learned, like, where they have that turning,
It used to be called Snake Hill.
Yeah, but the little rest you get.
They've actually straightened it out some. It's a sunken garden, and it's the landscaping on this property at this time was just absolutely spectacular. But some of the stuff, some of the stone walls and some of this is the sunken garden pool, it still exists today. I was talking to, I think it was Sheldon Pike in email, and she said that as kids they used to swim in this pool. That was like the kiddie pool.
The kiddie pool, yeah. And she was great. She shared with us so many photos.
Yeah.
A lot of photos you see today about the old house she shared with us.
I love this because this is the George Goodlett who owned the house from 1955 to 1963 or 64. He wrote this sales brochure for the house. And he describes the house and he says it's $200,000. It would cost $200,000 to replicate, but he was only selling it for $75,000. And it came with 7 acres of land. But look at the real estate taxes, $695. That's about a day and a half's worth of real estate taxes on the house. I think the last time I looked, real estate taxes on the house was about $50,000 a year.
This one's fun because a lot of you guys go to Huntington State Park. And we had a lot of fun together about this because we learned a lot about the individuals involved in the property. So Walter Lutkin was a pretty amazing individual. He was, we'll just call it, he was in the banking industry. He lived in Linden, New Jersey, and he was employed by Augustus Belmont. Belmont Steaks, they made it. Belmont Park, they made it, but they didn't only just make that. So he was a German.
Yeah, he dug the Cape Cod Canal.
Cape Cod Canal. They were investors in the first subway in New York City, but they were German as well. And so the house here, we didn't even do justice. There's a There's
We can spend all day just
more
on
and
this
more
house.
pictures about this house and how big it was and all the grounds, but this was just the place they kind of went to and wanted to chill. It wasn't like a summer house, it wasn't, he just came up here when he felt like it. He was so wealthy that
How wealthy was it?
he had a steam yacht.
On the
Yeah.
property,
Yeah, I'm out here,
a small paddle.
but when he was in New Jersey, he lived in Linden, he drove a steam yacht to work every day in New York City to Wall Street. That steam yacht was so large that when we went into World War I, they said, "Can we borrow it?" And he said, "Yeah." So we patrolled New York City Harbor and up Long Island Sound to Fire and Block Island in this steam yacht. It's called the Linta. So the Villa Linta probably ties to that yacht. But he built everything that we see in the present day minus the main house because unfortunately that house burned down. And then obviously the Huntingtons come in. But this guy was so interesting. Like Bruce Mills, like that still stands.
Yeah, that building still stands, it looks pretty much the same.
This building here housed 6 vehicles, one of them electric. This is 1909. Like, we were talking about this yesterday. How many cars do you think there were in Reading in 1909?
There's probably about 15 cars registered in the entire town. He has 6 of them at a summer house.
That he rarely occasionally visits.
You know, that summer house also housed a chauffeur. And back then, the chauffeur was more than just a driver. The chauffeur was also a mechanic. He was the guy that kept the cars running. Because these cars all needed a lot of work just to keep them working every single day.
And he lived here.
He lived in there.
And then you have the greenhouses. This is one of 2.
One of 2 big greenhouses.
And then to the backside, you have the lake that he created, which I believe was like 22-acre lake.
It's a 22-acre lake.
And they built this dam
By hand.
by hand.
80 Italian workers with big axes and shovels and.
Maybe boom cranes, like boom cranes would be like 2, like picture a boom crane like 2 telephone poles. And I don't even know how they moved the cables. But there was no excavator, there was no, bulldozer. That's a spillway. Like, we don't know how they did it, it's insane. But they built this humongous 22-acre.
Built 8 miles of road on the property just so that he could cruise around as a little electric car. And it was just to get around the property, which is all the hiking trails that are,
In the present day. Yeah, that's the part.
Now, he had his own power plant, because again, they didn't have electricity in Reading until the 1920s, late 20s or early 30s. They had his own gasoline-powered power plant, which is kind of ironic to have a gasoline-powered power plant, making the power to do your electric car.
But he did.
Yeah, he did. I think he liked to drive around the estate and have it quiet, because cars back then were very, very noisy. And he could just cruise around and he could listen to the birds and everything else while he was cruising around his little electric car.
Yeah, and there's pictures of his little niece who was 11 years old who knew how to drive this car. And it wasn't like a steering wheel, it was a car.
You can see right there, that's the tiller that's here.
Brent?
Yeah.
Michael McKee, and I'm in the Historical Society. His great-grandson just recently donated a wonderful oil painting that was elected to the Historical Society. It's now in the library upstairs.
Nice.
And it looks just like
Just like
the
that.
picture of him sitting in the car.
Well, hopefully.
So this is something that Bruce has done. It's the entire estate.
There's 460 acres of an estate. He bought most of this land from his next door neighbor, Lester Peck. Lester Peck also built a big house up on Sunset Hill, and Lester Peck's house is still standing, even though this house is no longer standing. And the only house that's still standing is this one that was been built for his sister. He had his own island that had a lighthouse on it, You know, it's a paddle boat that went around in the thing, and it said in 8 miles of track, and it complete working farm. They had all sorts of animals and flower gardens again, were beautiful.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, historyofreading.net, I have pictures of the whole, everything that his nephew sent is on there. This is it for sale.
And he died in 22, so the house went for sale pretty much right away. And I don't know, is this one's
That's Joseph. So Joseph, well, this was the other find, was, Joseph Edmund Starrett. So this guy was obviously the Place Word House, but he was absorbed by Place Word House. He was one of the greatest accountants in that time period. And he was the 11th, there was actually, believe it or not, an accounting hall of fame. He was the 11th, that was,
retired.
yeah, they retired his jersey, well after he passed, this was like in the 1950s. Yeah, he was a pretty amazing individual himself, and he was very active in the government, and he obviously lost the estate in the 1933.
The house burned down in 33, which is the same year that he passed away. So the house sat, the property sat vacant for probably about 5 or 6 years until the honeymoons came along.
Yeah.
And this is what that's it. The circle in there is where the house did stand. This was taken in 1934, so you can see where the house was, but it had already burned at that particular point.
And the Huntingtons come in, and
They saw an ad for $150,000 for 450 acres of land, so they thought that was pretty attractive, even at the time. That's a picture
Money
of
was
the
no-
in the early 20s.
money was no object. Archer Milne Huntington was the adopted son of Colescreen Huntington. He was the transcontinental railroad financer. He was wealthy beyond belief. Archer, pretty much his life was giving money away.
He still never ran back.
He still never ran out, but and Anna was, it said that her father was either a veterinarian or somehow connected with animals. So she loved animals, she loved horses, she loved dogs. So that's where the sculpture thing came into play. So they fell in love with this house. They rebuilt it. She was very afraid of fire. If you ever go down to Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina, you'll see their house. It's very much made of cement, and so that was a theme in her life. I would say if you're going to South Carolina, check that out. What I love about it is it's like 3 towns up from Georgetown, South Carolina, which is cool. So they came here and obviously fell in love with the place, and then they made their own improvements to it. And what's really kind of interesting is that it's named after a Scottish name. What was that name? Stannery, which means like Stony Ridge. And she raised this rare breed of Scottish deerhounds.
She's credited with saving the breed in this country.
It was very rare. Deerhounds were only really dogs that Scottish chieftains owned. They're a mixture of like a wolfhound, an Irish wolfhound, and a greyhound. They're very large, like 85 to 110 pounds, but they were really fast. So they're used to hunt deer. And she had champions.
In the dog world, she was well known for raising these dogs, as she was in the art world for her sculpture.
So it's a really neat thing about her and him. He passed away early. He probably passed away in 55. She lived until 1973, so she was 97. The last sculpture that I'm aware of is Putnam Park, which is the Israel Putnam sculpture. That was 1967. So she worked up her entire career.
It's really interesting. Towards her end of her life, she needed to go to either the hospital or the doctor, so she called the veterinary ambulance service. and Reading didn't have an ambulance that was available. So she called Bethel, and Bethel had an ambulance, and they sent the ambulance, and they took her to where she needed to go. And that happened to be very lucky for the Bethel ambulance service, because a couple of months later, she wrote a check and wanted to bring an ambulance.
Yeah, they're very giving. This is the layout of the compound. Not only did they have just, you know, breeding for the dogs, but also it was a working farm. Greenhouse, kennels, hay barns,
And they
sheep
built,
barns.
they built the house where the original house was built, and then they built, you can see the car studio is on there. And that's where she worked until she died.
This one is one of your favorites, but again, it ties back to Julia Sanford, who we talked about a couple times.
Yeah, Julia Sanford was involved in a lot of real estate deals. This is the Henry Lyon House. It was originally built in 1757, and it's affectionately known to as Aunt Julia's. When she died in 1924, the lights went on in that house, and there was a great big newspaper article in the Bridgeport Post about her, about how the lights were on, and how it was no longer going to be the happy place that it was. Henry Sanford Jr. acquired this house in 1813, and he had been married from the beginning. They raised 11 children. And upon Aaron's death in 1872, Julia inherited the house. She lived in the house from the time she was born until the time she died.
This one I noted too, because, I mean, you got 11 kids, it's probably tough to keep, I have 2. But the kids that lived here did pretty well. We had one that was in the Reading Institute, Dana. Adams Express, another one
That was
at
Henry.
Newtown Savings Bank,
Okay.
and then another one Williamsburg Fire Insurance, and they did really, really well. And that's just a short sampling.
Well, next. Right. And this is also unusual that Julia had a lifetime partner in Dr. Annie Mason Reed. And they were so open about it that they even announced that they were partners in the US Census, which was very, very rare in 1900 to be able to say that. They took over the original structure and they made it larger.
That way,
Yeah, they put on a big addition on the side, they put on the front porch. There's even what do I call it, tower. It's made of look. Back in the 1870s, a lot of people were trying to make colonial houses look like Queen Anne's, and that's what they did with this particular house. But Dr. Reed took in a lot of indigent patients and took care of them. They were always being very, very generous to take care of both orphans and other people, particularly young women, if they had some sort of medical problems. And this house, this picture was taken in 1887. And this was given to me by Laura Hilliard back there, who brought these pictures up all the way from Maryland, 2 different trips on the thing. And they're all pictures that were taken in the late 1800s by amateur photographers. It's very, very rare to see photographs like this, because generally the photographs that were taken during that particular period of time were taken by itinerant photographers that went around and they would try to board with somebody for a few days, and then they would take pictures, and you'd see pictures of a lot of old houses. They got everybody that lives in the house, the dog, the cat, the horse, a cow, everything that they owned to show how wealthy they were and how well they were doing. This is a pretty rare picture because everybody's kind of together. You've got Julia Sanford is on the far left. You've got Emma Reed. Now, Dr. Reed adopted 2 young girls, Emma and Ruth. And then the gentleman sitting on a rock behind is Samuel Carter Shaw. That's Julia's nephew. His mother was Annie, wasn't it? Yeah, I'm looking at my expert back there. It was Fanny Sanford, who married Edward Shaw, and Edward Shaw was a teacher at the Sanford Institute.
he was a headmaster at one time.
Yes, he was. And then standing is Marshall Sylvanus Briggs, who married Mary Sanford, who was Julia's sister. Both Fanny and Mary were Julia's sisters. she died early, she died in 1858, and said Marshall was the president of the Williamsburg Fire Insurance Company in Brooklyn. And it's pretty amazing because every time you would see an article in the Georgetown Bee of houses or barns that burned in Reading in the late 1800s, they were always insured by the Williamsburg Fire Insurance Company. And then you've got Dr. Reed, who's up at Harvard. This was taken in 1892, and there's a lot across the street from the house with a bunch of rocks on it. It was called a rock lot. This is pretty unusual because this was in 1892, this house had running water. What they did is they built a windmill and a holding tower. We've got a tank that's under there, and there's a windmill on top of it, which you'll see in another picture. And I said they would pump the water up and it would gravity feed it into the house so that they could run bathrooms and stuff on it. And this is, again, before they had electricity and electric pumps by 40 years at least. The barn is long gone, but this carriage house is right here, which you see is still standing on the property.
No, it's really amazing. I mean, running water was rare. I mean, Twain had it. Probably looking, maybe had it.
Yeah, because he had a pump, because like all the gasoline pump would pump it up.
But yeah, it was very rare in Reading at that time frame.
I love this picture because this is 1906, and this is getting ready to go up. This was again a party house. Every weekend there was a lot of guests, particularly in the summer, but even in the winter months. But it's really hard to see in this, but there's actually 8 people standing around that car. One lady's looking through by the floorboards right in front of the standing next to a lady with a hat just behind there. You can really see her face right through there. This was taken in February of 1910 after an ice storm. This is Route 58. Okay, as you can see the windmill that's up there. That's a full picture of the windmill. And this is barn, which is the same barn here. And looking south, there was a bunch of orchards through there. Those orchards, one of the houses that was built was for Annie Reed's daughter Ruth. There was a cottage, and that cottage still stands. Again, I like this one. This is looking north on Route 58 in front of the house.
Yeah, Meeker
Hill Road was just beyond this a little bit.
And you wouldn't use it with a kid today.
Yeah, a 2-year-old kid you want to stay alongside of Route 58. But I find it really interesting too, if you look at the stone walls and how tall they were, and how tightly packed they were. That's one of my favorites. That's taken in 1891.
Different time period.
This is Julia, and she's got Ruth on the horse here, and the barn there is built directly across the street from 140. They had 2 barns. They had a chicken coop. They had an ice house. I don't know, there was 2 or 3 other small outbuildings. Well, this is a cottage that was built. If you go back to that last slide for a second, the stone wall here is part of the foundation. That you can still see if you drive down 58 today. It's sitting in front of a house that sits up on that buildings. This is 133 Black Rock Turnpike, and this house, if you look at it, it's very familiar because it looks pretty much the same today. It's got a fence around it a little bit. But this house was originally used to house one of her workers, Frank Baldwin. Frank Baldwin was a black gentleman in the Baldwin family, and they grew up in the Little Egypt area, right in the Reading, Easton Town line. And the last descendant of that family is still alive, Diane Baldwin Robinson. And she's 82 years old. She's trying to write a book about the family right now. She's a very interesting woman. And then after Frank moved out, Frank and his wife lived in there with 8 children, so pretty tight quarters. But after she moved out, Minnie and Julia didn't like the school system in Reading, even though the Reading Ridge School was less than 200 feet north of the house. They had 1 teacher, and she was teaching probably, at the time, at that time they had already come up with 8 grades. So that she was teaching 8 grades, and she had about 20 students. So Julia and Annie didn't like that, so they hired their own tutor, and then the tutor ran a school in there, and they taught her kids and a couple of other neighborhood kids. I love this because it's a typical Reading picture of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Reading was pretty much all clear cut by then. They had views to everywhere. This is taken looking across the street and looking over towards, this hill would be off of Giles Hill Road there. But I said that was called that was called the tent lot. I don't know if the camp over there, what it was, the views are pretty expensive.
Yeah. That's interesting.
When Julie died in 1924, she left the house to her nephew, Edward Carter Shaw. And Shaw decided to put the house, make it look like it would have originally looked. So he took the wing off and took the front porch off. This picture is from 1937, believe it or not. It was taken by Dr. Goldborn, and he did a lot of color slides in 1937. Mark Twain Library has his complete collection of videos. It's pretty remarkable, clear pictures of some of these houses.
The Georgetown was just above.
Yeah, Shaw had originally built Pierpont. Pierpont was his estate. It was just north of the firehouse. You go past the firehouse and you look down the hill, there's two stone pillars. That leads down to Pierpont. Shaw built that in 1911, I think, and then he sold it to his stepson, Kempton Adams. And Kempton lived there until 1944, and when Kempton died, his widow sold it to Donald Jennings, who's a big Ford dealership down in New York City. And that house is still in the same family today. Donald Jennings' daughter still lives there, and I think she's in her 90s, I believe. Yeah, one of Brent's favorite places.
No, this is the last, my favorite, and what's really neat about it is that 100 years since it was made, like this year. And this is how I became acquainted with it. It was because of the anniversaries that we had celebrating Mark Twain's arrival here, and then his passing, his death, that we became acquainted with the DeSantis family. And they were great stewards of this property, and we got to know it well. I think Jake enjoyed it more than Erica did. But we were able to bring a lot of Mark Twain scholars to the property and explore it. And what's really neat about it is obviously, you know, the original house had burned down, but it was built upon the original foundation. So
What's the address?
it is off of Mark Twain Lane at the very end. And so we would bring scholars there, they would look at the house, they would walk around, and then they'd say, can we go in the basement? And they were always looking for like old manuscripts where there's this like magical thought that Mark Twain's voice was recording and on wax or something, and they thought it would be in there. After the fire, I can't imagine it would still exist, but this house is pretty special in that when they redid it in 1925, they maintained the overall look. They made it to their liking, but
They didn't put music room on top of it.
they kept, you know,
Kept
things
the
like
look, yeah.
this, like, you know, this was the original. So you can see, like, you know, there's little elements, you know, here and here that, you know, harkening back to the way it looked originally.
But they didn't want the billiard room right out the front door.
Yeah, I mean, why would you? I mean, obviously that was important to a certain individual, but yeah, and then, you know, instead of like having like the room up here, then you have the, you know, the nice little patio. So this room would be about where he passed away. And what was really cool was that on the anniversary of his death, the DeSantis invited us to the house to celebrate. So we were literally either exploring here or standing here, and it was, you know, 6-ish, 7-ish, and a plane went across and was doing that vapor trail, just like a Halley's Comet. So, you know, being Twainiacs, which means Twain/Maniacs, we were like, oh my god! You know, it was kind of a neat little thing, but it is neat. Bruce, you can Google it, did a really, we're not gonna do it tonight, because, you know, but the women of Stormfield was really, really interesting.
Because for the first 100 and some odd years, only women owned this house. This was not owned by any gentleman, nobody except the women. Isabel Lyon helped design the house, and she built the house. Samuel Clemens never saw this house until he set foot in it in 1908 when he first came to Reading. He's told her the things that were important. He had to have a kitten on the hearth, and had to have a billiards room right inside the main room, and there was a couple of other things. And then Clara, his daughter, came along, and when it was already partially constructed, and said, "There's no music room for me." So she added another $30,000 worth of his expenses. He wasn't very happy about that. He built her own suite upstairs with the music room. But after Twain died in 1910, Clara decided she really didn't want the house. She did stay there long enough for her only daughter to be born there in August of 1910. But then she put the house for sale. And I think on this one, pretty sure this was offered also by Julia Sanford. One of these houses, either Villa Lindo or this was offered by Julia Sanford, as well as another relative. But anyway, Clara put this house on the market for around $100,000, which was too much money back then, which you couldn't go buy. It stayed on the market for probably 13 or 14 years. During the First World War, she offered it to the U.S. government for a convalescent home for guys coming back from the war that were wounded. I don't think they ever took her up on it, and I don't know if she ever was willing to give title to the land to the U.S. government or not, but she did offer it as a hospital. Finally, in the 1922, 1923 area, she dropped the price from over $100,000 to $50,000. And Margaret Gibbon, who had looked at this house when she was still married to her husband, came back and looked at it again because she decided that she really liked this house. And she made a ridiculous offer of $30,000, and Clara took it. So she bought the house for $30,000 in 1923. Right after, unfortunately, as soon as they started renovations on the house, and they were living in the house at the time, we think probably that there were painters in the house and they had left rags in a bucket that were soaked with turpentine and spontaneously caught on fire and burned the house to the ground. This was all that was left standing the next day. They did manage to save a mantle, a pool table, and a couple of...
Yeah, I don't buy that though, because, so I think what had happened was that over the course of time, you know, Lounsbury was tended to be the caretaker of the house when he was here. I think they kind of moved stuff out of the house over the course of time. There's no way that this house would have, because the thing of the matter for me is that there was like, this had running water because there was humongous tanks.
There was two 1,000-gallon tanks in the attic. They gave the running water. There was what, 5 bathrooms, I think.
And it was like, it was faux stucco. Like, there's a good chance that it was like, ever invented woven wire, blown in stucco. So it would have run up way too fast for anyone to come running and save
Well, one would
anything.
think if the water towers were full, it was just the fire itself should have burned the bottom of the towers, and the water should have just come out and put it out.
It's
2,000 gallons of water.
No, it's really true. That's all that was left. So anyway, the mantle, which is Scottish, was saved and it's in Hartford now. So it all turned out well.
So Margaret Gibbons decided that she wasn't willing to rebuild the house, but that was, I guess, bad luck. So she sold it to, turn it back, I can't remember, to Mary Goodrich Millett. And she bought the entire estate, less the house, and she bought two standing chimneys for $20,000. And then she and her mother took off for Europe, while she hired a crew to build the house using the same plans. And while she was in Europe, she bought a tin ceiling or metal ceiling. She's still in the house today.
Yeah, that's, I'll show you, I'll point that out. No, what's really cool about this is that, if you think about, so we come in from Diamond Hill, we go up Marchway Lane, but because Mark Twain had purchased, the Hermes house, as we call it, Jean's Farm was Hermes' house. So there was a driveway that went all the way across to 107. So the other end of 107 is Glenhill Lane, and the Banks family lived there. So they were the ones that rebuilt this. So what she wanted to do was to make a replica that wasn't exactly, so this whole thing is on an exact same structure, but it's just a replica that kind of fit her needs at the time period. I think she did a pretty nice job. And this is it from the outside. So this is looking at it from, say, Susan Derby's house on Marchway Lane. And I really like the fact that they, the loggia was kind of saved, and then this would be the porch up here. So I think the replica is rock solid.
They did adjust this.
This is the roof, so these are, you can see the number of banks. Banks is really interesting to the whole story, because if you've ever heard of the story of the burglary at Stormfield, Banks was the sheriff. He was the one who caught the burglars. And they had a big shootout on a train, and there's gunshots and gunshot wounds, but the Banks family remained true to the family, and like I said, they lived just over the hill, and they rebuilt it. So this is then probably Falls Hole-ish area, or somewhere within the reservoir area. This is just about, they finished it up in the fall, so this is about that, just before they really finished it up. My favorite is this guy being held up at 2 years. Yeah, you're welcome. This is the way the house looked before the renovations in 1994. This is the ceiling that her mom picked up in Europe. That still exists to the present day, which is really cool. So, they refurnished it. But yeah, you can see, I mean, this is actually probably modern back in that time. This is a built-in bridge and cabinetry. But the renovations were, I mean, like I said,
Put an elevator in the house.
Elevator for a mom.
Yeah, the house was pretty modern inside for 1925.
I think when the DeSantis purchased it, they pretty much renovated the attic area, put in some new bathrooms upstairs. It's a gorgeous property. This is the way it looks from the sky today. This is our last slide. The best day, obviously I had a great day, the day that we watched the airplane fly this way, like Haley's time, it was cool. But Jake and Erica had a nice party here one late afternoon evening, and if you guys think about it, well, maybe I'll just tell you now. So to fund the library, Mark Twain had, just before Clara's wedding, 1909, by September.
And use a cap.
500 people showed up, and that helped to fund the foundation of the library. Not necessarily this one, but the one on Diamond Hill and Umpqua, Warner. And I love the fact that that couple just cleared away all the trees so you can actually see the chapel. So Mark Twain's first library was a chapel that overlooked Umpqua Cemetery. Now it's a house. So they had a party and a concert. There's a live band playing down here. There was people our age all over here, and then he had hired a company that took care of kids to play games, all the adults' hair. And the kids were going crazy up here. Oops, my bad. The kids were going crazy up here, and we were having fun down here, and the band was going crazy here. And it just kind of like made me think about that and how it's going full circle. And like I said, this house is now 100 years old. And I thought that was really neat that we're talking about it tonight. So I want to thank you guys all for being here tonight to share that with us.